The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the streets of Ashland glazed in a pale gray sheen. Outside the courthouse, the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and pine needles. Michael Bennett stood beneath the awning, his hands deep in the pockets of his wool coat, watching the mist drift between the trees. He wasn't nervous. Those feelings had burned out long ago. What remained was a kind of quiet exhaustion, like the echo of a storm that had already passed. Lauren arrived a few minutes later. Her heels clicked softly against the marble steps, each sound neat and deliberate, as if she were walking through a business meeting rather than the final hour of a marriage. She nodded politely to him. He nodded back. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Inside, the courtroom was nearly empty. A clerk shuffled papers. The judge spoke in a tone that could have belonged to anyone reading from a script. 10 years of shared life, trips, holidays, dinners, silences, summed up in a few legal sentences. Lauren answered questions clearly, her voice calm. Michael did the same. Neither looked at the other for long. There was nothing left to say that could change anything. When it was over, the judge wished them peace and closure, words that hung strangely in the sterile air. Lauren collected her handbag, signed the last form, and turned to him. Her smile was faint, tired, but not unkind. "I guess this is it," she said. Michael nodded. "Yeah." She hesitated, studying his face, as if searching for something that used to be there. "You know, Michael," she said finally, "I don't blame you for anything." "Not really." He frowned slightly. "For what?" "For never loving me the way you loved her." Her tone wasn't bitter, just matter of fact, like someone naming a truth too old to hurt anymore. "You thought I didn't know, but I did. I saw it in the way you went quiet sometimes, as if you were talking to a ghost." He wanted to deny it, to say something comforting, but nothing would have been true. Instead, he gave a slow nod. "I am sorry, Lauren." She offered a small, sad smile. "Don't be. I think you were meant for someone else from the start." They walked out together, the way strangers might leave a waiting room after hearing different diagnoses. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart, streaks of light cutting through the mist. Lauren's driver pulled up. She gave him one last look before stepping into the car. "Take care of yourself, Michael," she said softly. Then the door closed, and she was gone. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the taillights fade down the wet street. He felt no relief, no grief, only a strange stillness, the kind that comes when everything collapses quietly instead of exploding. He loosened his tie and walked to his car parked beneath a row of maple trees. The leaves were turning red and gold, scattering across the hood like confetti from someone else's celebration. He sat there for a long time, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine before starting the drive into town. The cafe sat on a corner near the theater district, a small place with old wooden tables and the smell of espresso soaked into the walls. Peter Wallace was already there, his jacket slung over the chair, tapping his phone with the impatience of a man who'd been told to relax too many times. Michael slid into the seat across from him. "So," Peter said, eyeing him, "it's done." "It's done." Peter studied his friend for a moment, then leaned back. "You don't look free." Michael gave a hollow smile. "Freedom's overrated." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of rain returning lightly against the windows. Finally, Peter spoke. "You ever think about finding her? The one you lost?" Michael's eyes drifted to the glass, where the faint reflection of his face blurred with the moving cars outside. "Every day," he said quietly, "even after all this time." Peter sighed. "You really think she's still out there?" Michael didn't answer right away. The steam from his coffee curled upward, fading into the dim morning light. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I still dream about her, and in those dreams she's never gone." Outside, the drizzle turned into fine silver threads again. washing over Ashland like a whisper that the past was not done with him. Yet, 20 years earlier, the air around Crater Lake smelled of rain and cedar. The narrow road wound through a forest of evergreens, their needles glistening with mist. Michael Bennett was 25 then, ambitious, restless, full of the kind of confidence that made him believe he could bend life to his will. He had come to the mountains to meet a potential supplier for his small leather goods startup, renting a modest room at a roadside motel that smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old wood polish. That morning, he stood beneath the thin stream of the shower, humming to himself, half thinking about business, half listening to the sound of wind brushing against the window. He had just turned off the water when the door creaked open. A young woman stepped inside, balancing a stack of towels. Her eyes widened the instant she saw him, bare-chested and dripping wet. The towels slipped from her hands and scattered across the floor. "Oh, my God, I'm so sorry," she blurted, her cheeks burning scarlet. She backed toward the door, nearly tripping over a cleaning cart. Michael grabbed a towel and laughed, startled but amused. "No harm done," he said, his voice gentle. "Wrong room." "I thought it was empty," she said quickly. "The front desk," they said. He raised a hand, smiling. "It's fine. Really." For a moment, they just looked at each other, both embarrassed, both laughing now despite themselves. Her laughter was light and nervous, like a note carried by wind. "I'll just, come back later," she murmured, collecting the towels with clumsy haste. He wrapped the towel around his waist, still smiling. "You work here?" She nodded, her ponytail damp with stray raindrops. "Housekeeping. My name's Isabella. Isabella Moore." "Michael," he said. "And I think this is probably the most memorable room service I've ever had." Her lips curved into an involuntary smile. "It's not usually this exciting. I promise." That awkward encounter might have ended there. But later that evening, when he came down to the motel cafe for dinner, she was there again, behind the counter this time, refilling coffee cups and wiping down tables. When she noticed him, she froze for a second before laughing softly. "You survived," she teased. He grinned. Barely. They talked between her rounds of serving customers. He learned she was 22, taking classes in early childhood education at a local community college. Orphaned at 15, she had bounced through foster homes before aging out of the system. Everything she owned fit into a single suitcase, and everything she dreamed of was simple: earning her degree, maybe one day teaching at an elementary school, maybe having a family of her own. Something about her honesty disarmed him. There was no artifice in her, no pretense. Just quiet strength. When she spoke about the children she helped at the daycare near the motel, her whole face lit up. He found himself stopping by the cafe each evening. Sometimes he'd bring sketches of shoe designs he was working on. She'd lean over them, fascinated, her fingers tracing the pencil lines as if they were secret maps. She teased him about his perfectionism. He teased her about her endless optimism. It was easy, natural. One night, after her shift, they walked along the edge of the forest. The moonlight spilled over the lake like liquid glass. Isabella shivered slightly in the cold, and he slipped his jacket over her shoulders. She looked up at him, eyes bright in the dark. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "I think I'm starting to," he replied. "And that's enough for now." That was the night he kissed her for the first time. Tentative, unsure, like testing the weight of something fragile and irreplaceable. Weeks blurred into months. They found a small rental cabin on the outskirts of Ashland. She studied, he worked on his designs. They built a life from little things: shared breakfasts, laughter over burnt toast, evenings spent by the fireplace. It wasn't wealth that made those days golden. It was the simplicity of loving someone who made the world seem new. One weekend, Michael sat at his workbench, shaping a strip of silver into a slender bracelet. On the inside, he engraved 3 small words by hand, "For my forever." When he gave it to her, she stared at it in disbelief. "You made this," she whispered. He nodded, smiling. "It's not perfect." She slipped it onto her wrist, the metal catching the firelight. "It's perfect to me," she said, and when she leaned in to kiss him, her whisper brushed his skin like a promise. "Then it's forever." Portland had always felt too polished to Michael. All glass towers and quiet money, the kind of city where everything gleamed but nothing really breathed. The Bennett mansion stood at the edge of the city, a vast white colonial house framed by trimmed hedges and the faint scent of magnolia. That afternoon, as he pulled into the driveway with Isabella beside him, the air felt heavy enough to cut. She looked nervous, smoothing her simple cream dress. "Your parents don't even know I'm coming, do they?" Michael gave a half-smile meant to reassure her. "They'll love you. You're kind, you're smart, and you make me better. What's not to love?" But as soon as they stepped inside, the gulf between worlds was obvious. His mother, Helen Bennett, greeted them in pearls and a silk blouse, her posture flawless. Charles Bennett stood by the fireplace with a scotch in hand, his eyes sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses. "Mother." "Father, this is Isabella Moore," Michael said with quiet pride. Helen extended her hand politely. "So nice to meet you, dear," she said, her tone gracious but distant. Charles nodded, giving the sort of measured smile people use in photographs. For the first half-hour, everything seemed civil. Helen served tea. Charles asked polite questions about Isabella's studies. But then, as conversation drifted toward family, Helen's teacup paused midair. "You mentioned before you grew up in Salem," she said. "Your parents must be proud of you." Isabella hesitated. I never knew them. I was raised in the foster system." The silence that followed was thin and cold. Helen set her cup down carefully. "Oh, I see." Charles cleared his throat, forcing another smile. "Well, that must have been character building." The conversation faltered after that. Helen's warmth faded, replaced by the faintly polite smile of someone enduring a mistake. Charles began talking to Michael about his business, steering the subject away from her entirely. When dinner ended, Helen followed Michael into the hallway. "She's a sweet girl," she said softly, "but she's not right for you." He turned, frowning. "Not right? You barely know her." Helen's voice remained calm, motherly, but her words cut sharp. "You're from different worlds, darling. You've worked so hard to build a name in Portland, to be respected. It's not what your father or I envisioned for you." Michael's jaw tightened. "I'm not marrying her for your reputation." Her gaze hardened. "You'll regret this. Love doesn't pay for houses or futures, or the kind of life you deserve." Before he could answer, Charles appeared in the doorway. "Son," he said evenly, "we need to talk." They moved into his office, a room lined with law books and the smell of aged whiskey. "Your mother's right," Charles began. "You're infatuated, that's all. A phase. But if you let this continue, you'll destroy everything we've worked for." Michael stared at him. "Worked for? You mean your name?" "I mean your future," Charles said flatly. "End this now, or I'll cut you off completely. No inheritance, no investment money, nothing. Think carefully." For a long moment, Michael said nothing. Then he stood, his hands trembling, not from fear, but fury. "Then cut me off," he said quietly, "because I'm not ending this." He walked out before either of them could stop him. In the driveway, Isabella waited by the car, her eyes questioning. "It didn't go well, did it?" He shook his head, his voice breaking just slightly. "No, but it doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. Together." That night, they packed their things from his apartment and drove south, headlights slicing through the rain. The city lights of Portland faded behind them. swallowed by the dark ribbon of the highway. By the time they reached Ashland, dawn was creeping over the hills, soft and uncertain. They found a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a bakery that smelled of yeast and cinnamon. It wasn't much, peeling paint, a squeaky faucet, but it was theirs. As Isabella stood at the window watching the sunrise, Michael wrapped his arms around her and whispered, "Let them keep their mansion. This is home." The wind howled through Ashland that evening, carrying the smell of rain and wood smoke. The sky had turned the color of wet slate, thunder rolling low across the hills. Michael drove home later than usual, his windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. He'd stayed late at the workshop, finishing a batch of orders before the weekend. Isabella had called earlier, her voice bright and teasing. "Don't be late, I made stew," she'd said. He had promised he'd be home by 7. Now, as he turned onto their narrow street, the first thing he saw was the flash of red and blue lights cutting through the storm. The second thing was the smoke, thick black, and rising from the small house they'd made a home. For a moment, his mind refused to understand. Then he slammed on the brakes and ran into the rain. "Sir, you can't go in there," a firefighter shouted, grabbing his arm. Michael tore free, his heart pounding like a hammer. The air was hot, heavy with the scent of burning wood and chemicals. Through the haze he could see the roof collapsing inward, flames curling up like the hands of something alive. "Isabella!" he screamed, his voice raw. "Isabella's inside." 2 firefighters blocked his way, dragging him back as he struggled against them. "We already swept the house," one of them said, his voice muffled through the mask. There was no response. "The structure's unstable, you can't go in." "No." "You don't understand," Michael gasped, fighting to breathe. "She was cooking dinner, she was waiting for me." But the only answer was the roar of fire and the hiss of water from the hoses. The house that had once smelled of cinnamon and candle wax was now a skeleton of black beams and glowing embers. When the roof finally caved in, the sound was like a gunshot that emptied the world of air. He fell to his knees in the mud, rain mixing with ash on his skin. A paramedic approached, trying to lead him to the ambulance, but he pulled away. "She's not gone," he muttered, half to himself. "She can't be." When the fire finally surrendered to the storm, what remained was little more than smoke and ruin. Michael stumbled past the caution tape, ignoring the shouts behind him. Inside what used to be the living room, he knelt among the debris, his fingers shaking as he brushed away soot. There, half buried beneath a beam, he found it, Isabella's pale blue sweater, one sleeve charred at the edge. And beside it, her slippers, melted slightly from the heat, but still recognizable. He lifted them in his hands, his chest tightening until it hurt to breathe. The fire chief found him there, crouched in the rubble, rain dripping from his hair. "I'm sorry, sir," the man said gently. "There was no one else inside. We'll do a full report in the morning." Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. He sat in silence until the rain turned the ashes into gray mud. Later that night, he stood on the sidewalk, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching what was left of their house. The flashing lights blurred through the fog of his tears. Peter arrived, face pale beneath his soaked jacket. "God, Michael," he whispered. "I came as soon as I heard." Michael didn't look at him. His voice was hoarse, broken. "It wasn't an accident." Peter frowned. "What are you talking about?" He turned toward him, eyes wild with grief. "My father," he said. "He wanted her gone. He made it clear she'd ruin everything. You think it's a coincidence this happened while I was away?" Peter hesitated, unable to find words. Michael stared at the ruins, fists clenched. "He took her from me," he whispered, "and I swear I'll never forgive him." The rain kept falling, washing the soot down the street. But nothing could wash away what he saw that night. The faint outline of their life burned into the dark, and the echo of her laughter lost in the fire. Years slipped by like mist over the hills, quiet and ungraspable. Ashland changed. New shops appeared downtown. Old ones vanished. But for Michael, time had no shape. Days bled into one another, marked only by the soft hum of machines in his workshop and the silence that filled his house after dark. He still lived in Ashland, though not in the place where their home had burned. The new house was larger, brighter, and emptier. Its white walls looked clean, but never warm. And even the ticking of the clock felt too loud. He kept a single photo of Isabella, creased and fading, on the shelf above his desk. Sometimes, late at night, he'd catch himself talking to it in a whisper, as though she were still listening. The fire had taken everything that tethered him to life. He stopped seeing friends, stopped answering calls. His parents had covered the funeral expenses, arranged everything without asking, and left him a check to start over. He tore it up. What he couldn't tear up were the whispers. Neighbors saying it was a tragedy, co-workers murmuring that he'd gone strange. Lauren Hayes was the only one who stayed. She had been a family friend for years, kind, practical, with an easy laugh that could fill a quiet room. After the fire, she started stopping by with groceries, with casseroles he never touched, with patient conversation that asked for nothing in return. At first, he barely acknowledged her. He was polite but distant, his grief a fortress she couldn't breach. Yet she kept showing up, sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, talking about anything but the fire. Sometimes he found himself listening, about her work at her father's company, about her mother's garden, about small, ordinary things that sounded like another planet. His parents adored her. Helen, especially, saw in Lauren everything she had once wanted for her son. Stability, family, respectability. "She's good for you," she would say, smiling too brightly. "You deserve a future, Michael." He never argued, though he didn't believe her. What future was left for a man who still woke to the smell of smoke? Months turned into years. Under the slow pressure of his parents' concern and Lauren's unwavering gentleness, Michael began to drift back into life. He reopened his workshop, expanded it, and before long his handcrafted shoes were being sold in Portland boutiques. Success came almost by accident. He poured himself into work the way other people poured themselves into prayer. Each design was perfect, disciplined, emotionless. Customers called it timeless. He called it survival. When he finally married Lauren, it wasn't out of love. It was out of exhaustion. The ceremony was small, tasteful, attended mostly by family. Lauren looked radiant, her eyes full of hope. Michael smiled for the photographs, because everyone expected him to. That night, when they were alone, she kissed him softly and said, "We'll make it work." He wanted to believe her. For a while he tried. He took her to dinner, bought her flowers, learned to speak in calm tones. They laughed sometimes, and she made him tea when his headaches came. But the truth hung between them like fog. His heart had been buried long before their vows. Lauren never complained. She built a home around his silence, filled it with light and music, as if she could banish the ghosts by sheer will. And yet, when she caught him staring out the window at nothing, she knew where his thoughts had gone. By the time their 10th anniversary arrived, they were more companions than lovers. 2 quiet people moving through parallel lives. He worked late. She hosted charity luncheons. From the outside, they looked perfect. Inside, he was still listening for a voice that would never answer. Decades blurred into one another like gray watercolor. The world moved on, but Michael didn't. Every storm that passed through Ashland carried the same smell of wet cedar and smoke, and every time, he found himself looking toward the horizon, wondering if some part of her had survived, if love that deep could ever really burn away. Rain whispered against the window like a tired lullaby, soft and steady. The years had turned Michael's nights into long stretches of quiet routine. Tea gone cold on the desk, the faint hum of his computer, and the dull glow of the city through the blinds. He rarely slept before midnight. Instead, he scrolled through the empty noise of social media, half out of habit, half to feel less alone. That evening, the storm outside seemed to mirror something in him. Unresolved, restless. He sipped his tea and opened his messages. Notifications flickered across the screen. Old colleagues congratulating him on another business award. Customers tagging his store in glossy photos. All of it felt distant. But one small detail caught his eye. A visitor to his profile, the same one who had appeared every day for nearly a month. No name he recognized. Just a simple username. Anam. No photo, no posts. Nothing but that silent presence, returning again and again. At first, he ignored it, but curiosity, slow and persistent, began to creep in. One night, he clicked the profile and sent a message. You seem to know me. Should I know you? An hour passed, then 2. He was about to shut down the laptop when the reply arrived. Maybe you used to. Something in those 3 words made his pulse quicken. The phrasing soft, a little poetic, felt strangely familiar. He typed again, fingers trembling slightly. Have we met? A long time ago. He leaned back, studying the screen. It could have been anyone, someone who'd read about him online, a fan, a scam. But her tone wasn't demanding or flirtatious. It was quiet, careful, as if she were holding a secret between her hands. Over the next few days, they talked. Nothing deep at first, books, weather, music. She said she loved old jazz records. The smell of rain, the way autumn light turned everything gold. She said she worked in education, though she never named the city. Her words carried a warmth he hadn't felt in years, a rhythm that stirred something buried deep inside him. By the 3rd night, he caught himself smiling at the screen. She teased him for his obsession with black coffee. He told her about his workshop and the sound of the machines that lulled him to sleep. It felt easy, natural, too natural. One evening, after a long exchange about childhood memories, he asked, "Why do you sound so familiar?" There was a pause before she replied, "Maybe you're remembering something you never forgot." The words hit him like a whisper from another lifetime. He stared at the screen, the rain outside blurring the lights into streaks of silver. Could it be? The thought was absurd, and yet he typed carefully, "You remind me of someone I once knew." "Someone you lost," she replied. His throat tightened. "Yes." Another pause. Then, maybe not lost, maybe just misplaced. He sat frozen, his heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and longing. It couldn't be her. Isabella was gone. He had seen the ashes, the ruins, the proof. But the way this stranger wrote, the cadence of her sentences, even the quiet humor, it was as if the years had melted away and he was 25 again, sitting by the fire, listening to her laugh. He typed one more message. "If I asked who you are, would you tell me?" The reply came almost immediately. "Not yet." For the next week, they continued their strange, delicate conversation. Each night, he promised himself he wouldn't reach out again, and each night he did. He learned her favorite flowers were cream roses, her favorite drink chamomile tea. When he mentioned the silver bracelet he'd once made, she went silent for a long moment before replying, "Beautiful things never really vanish, do they?" He barely slept after that. Finally, on the 7th night, as thunder rolled once more through the valley, a new message appeared. "Meet me at Café Victoria, 7 p.m. No signature, no smiley face, just that." He stared at the words for a long time, the clock ticking past midnight, his heart beating like it hadn't in decades. For the first time in years, Michael Bennett felt something close to fear, because hope, when it returns after so long, feels almost like pain. The next evening, Ashland was awash in soft rain, the kind that fell in silvery lines and made the streetlights glow like halos. Café Victoria sat at the corner of Main and First, its windows fogged with warmth, the faint hum of jazz drifting through the glass. Michael parked across the street and sat in the car for a long time. gripping the bouquet of pale cream roses resting on the passenger seat. His heart hadn't raced like this in 20 years. He checked his watch. 6:58. 2 minutes. It felt absurd. This nervous hope rising inside him. This sense that he was about to step into a dream he'd already lived once before. He took a slow breath, grabbed the flowers, and crossed the street. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans. People talked quietly over cups of tea, the air heavy with warmth. Michael scanned the tables, women in coats, students with laptops, a mother reading to her child. But no one looked like the woman from his messages. He stood there, bouquet in hand, feeling foolish, a man chasing ghosts. He turned toward the counter, meaning to order coffee just to have something to do, when he bumped into someone, a woman, balancing a tray of empty cups, nearly dropped them all. "I'm so sorry," he said, steadying the tray before it tipped. "I didn't see," his words stopped. Her wrist brushed his hand, and there, beneath the sleeve of a worn gray sweater, glimmered a familiar curve of silver. The bracelet, the one he had made by hand, engraved with 3 small words, "For my forever." The world tilted. The sound in the cafe fell away. He reached out, his voice barely a whisper. "Isabella." The woman froze. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to his. Time folded in on itself. 20 years dissolved in an instant. The same blue-gray eyes, the same dimple that appeared when she was nervous, the same breathless stillness that had once filled the space between them. "Michael!" she whispered, her voice trembling. He stepped closer, afraid she might vanish if he blinked. "It's you, my God, it's really you." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she let out a half-laugh, half-sob. "It's me," she said softly. "And I thought I was ready for this, but I'm not." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he dropped the bouquet onto the counter and pulled her into his arms. She didn't resist. The tray clattered to the floor as she held onto him, trembling, crying, laughing all at once. The cafe had gone quiet. A few people stared, curious, but he didn't care. He could smell the faint hint of jasmine in her hair, the same scent he thought he'd lost forever. When they finally pulled apart, she wiped her tears with the back of her hand, embarrassed. "You're making a scene," she said, trying to smile through her shaking voice. He laughed, breathless. "I've waited 20 years to make this scene." She looked down, eyes darting toward the bracelet. "You kept it," he said softly. "I never took it off," she whispered. "Not once." He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, how she'd survived, where she'd been, why she'd stayed away, but none of them made it past his lips. All he could do was stare, memorizing every line of her face, as if it were proof that miracles still existed. Finally, she said, "We should talk." "Not here." He nodded, picking up the flowers from the counter, their petals now flecked with coffee stains. "Come with me," he said. "Please." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. "I get off in 20 minutes, she said quietly. "Wait for me outside." When he stepped into the rain again, his hands were trembling. The street glowed under the lamplight, and for the first time in years, the rain didn't feel cold. He stood under the awning, watching through the glass as she wiped down the last table, her movements slow, deliberate. Every so often, she glanced toward the window, their eyes meeting for the briefest heartbeat before she looked away. At exactly 7:25, she appeared at the door, wearing a faded coat and clutching her small purse. She looked both older and exactly the same. He handed her the roses. "I still owe you dinner," he said gently. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "And I still make terrible stew." They both laughed, the sound fragile but real. Without another word, they started walking down the quiet street, side by side beneath a single umbrella. The rain softened to a drizzle, and as they turned the corner toward the park, she whispered, "There's so much I need to tell you, Michael. So much you don't know. He glanced at her, heart aching in disbelief and wonder. Then tell me everything, he said. And as the city lights faded behind them, Isabella nodded, her fingers brushing his. The smallest touch, but enough to make him believe that maybe, after all these years, love had found its way back through the fire. The drive back to Michael's house was quiet. The rain had eased into a fine mist that turned the pavement silver beneath the streetlights. Inside the car, the faint hum of the heater filled the silence between them. Isabella sat with her hands folded in her lap, the silver bracelet glinting faintly in the dashboard glow. Michael kept glancing at her, afraid that if he looked away too long, she might vanish again. When they reached the house, he hung his coat by the door and lit the fireplace. The air filled with the scent of cedar wood and smoke, and for a moment he couldn't help but remember another night, another fire, but one that had taken everything instead of warming it. She stood near the mantel, her gaze tracing the framed photographs of landscapes and his workshop, none of them showing a human face. "You live alone," she murmured. He nodded. "I got good at it." Then, gently, "Tell me what happened, Isabella. Please." For a long moment, she didn't answer. The flames flickered in her eyes, as if weighing whether to trust him with the truth. Finally, she exhaled, her voice low but steady. "That night, the night of the fire, it wasn't an accident. But I didn't die, Michael. I ran." He froze. "You ran?" She nodded. "Because I had no choice." He sank into the chair by the fire, every muscle tense. "Why?" She clasped her hands together. "Your father came to see me that afternoon. You were at work and I was home alone. He said he wanted to talk." The air in the room seemed to thicken. "He told me," she continued, "that he'd had enough of my fairy tale delusion. That you were his only son, his legacy. That you'd never forgive yourself for what would happen if you stayed with me. He said he could make things very difficult for both of us, especially me." Michael's jaw tightened. "He threatened you?" "He said he'd have drugs planted in our house," she whispered. "That I'd go to prison for possession, and you'd lose everything. Your business, your reputation, your family name. He said no one would believe a girl like me over a man like him." Michael stood abruptly, pacing in disbelief. "My God, he actually said that." Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't know what to do. I begged him to stop, to let us live our lives. He told me the only way to protect you was to disappear." She looked down, her voice breaking. "He said he'd take care of it, that the fire would make it look real, that you'd move on." Michael pressed a hand over his mouth, the weight of her words crashing down on him. "And you believed him?" "I was terrified," she said. "And then the night after, I found out I was pregnant." His breath caught. "I couldn't tell you," she continued, shaking her head. "I didn't even know how. I had no family, no money. No papers. He'd arranged everything. I took the name Isabella Moore, moved 3 towns over, and started over. I worked in a daycare, then a school. I raised him alone. He never knew about you. For a long time, the only sound was the soft crackle of the fire. Michael's face was pale, his hands trembling as he stared into the flames. "How old is he?" he asked quietly. 20, she said. "His name is Luke." He nodded slowly, letting the name sink in. Luke, his son, the child he never knew existed. Tears welled in his eyes, not the kind that came from grief, but from the unbearable mixture of joy and sorrow that came from discovering something too precious and too late. "All these years," he whispered, "you were out there, raising our son, while I thought you were gone." She took a hesitant step toward him. "I wanted to tell you, Michael, so many times, but I was afraid of him, of what might happen if he found out I'd come back." He turned to her, anger flickering through the sorrow. "He's dead now, Isabella. My father's gone. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Her shoulders sagged, as if some invisible chain had loosened. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I reached out. I wanted you to know the truth before it was too late." He stared at her for a long moment, then crossed the room and took her hands. "You did what you had to do. You survived. You protected our son. You don't need to be sorry for that." Her eyes shimmered with tears. "I thought you'd hate me for leaving." "I could never hate you," he said quietly. "Only the man who made you choose." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The firelight danced across their faces, the years between them flickering like shadows on the wall. Finally, Michael drew a shaky breath. "I need to meet him, Isabella. Please let me see our son." She looked up, hesitant but hopeful. "If you really want to, I've already lost 20 years, he said softly. "I'm not losing another day." And for the first time in decades, she smiled through her tears, because in his voice she could finally hear the man she had once loved, still waiting beneath all the ashes. The next afternoon, gray clouds hung low over Ashland, pressing the light flat and cold against the earth. Michael parked in front of a small yellow house tucked behind a row of birch trees. The lawn was overgrown, the porch sagged a little, and yet, when he looked at it, something in his chest stirred. It was a home, the kind built not from wealth but survival. Inside, the smell of coffee and books filled the narrow living room. The walls were lined with family photos, none of which included him. Isabella hovered by the window, fidgeting with her bracelet. "He doesn't know you're coming," she said quietly. "I wanted to tell him first, but I didn't know how he'd react." Michael nodded. "Then let me." From the back room came the rhythmic sound of wheels against hardwood. Luke appeared in the doorway, pushing himself forward in a sleek black wheelchair. He was tall and lean, his dark hair falling into his eyes, his face a striking mirror of Isabella's youth, with something sharper beneath it, something that made Michael's breath catch. "Mom." Luke said, his tone suspicious. "Who's this?" Isabella's hands twisted together. "This is someone I want you to meet." Michael stepped forward, his throat dry. "My name's Michael Bennett." He hesitated, then added softly, "I'm your father." For a second, silence filled the room, so completely it seemed to hum. Luke blinked, disbelief flashing to anger. "What kind of joke is this?" "It's not a joke," Isabella said, tears already forming. "I should have told you sooner," he cut her off, his voice sharp. "You said he was dead. My whole life. You told me he died before I was born." "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "Protecting me from what?" His hands gripped the wheels, knuckles white. "From the truth." He turned toward Michael, eyes blazing. "And you? Where the hell were you for 20 years? Michael swallowed hard. "I didn't know, Luke. I thought your mother was gone. I thought she died in the fire." "Fire?" Luke laughed bitterly. "That's convenient." "It's true," Michael said. "Your grandfather, my father, forced her to disappear. He threatened her life. He made her fake her death to save me." Luke's expression faltered, confusion cutting through the rage. "What are you talking about?" Isabella stepped closer, her voice trembling. "It's the truth, sweetheart. He would have destroyed your father's business, his future. He said he'd frame me for something I didn't do. I was scared. I didn't know I was pregnant until after I left." Luke looked between them, his chest rising and falling quickly. "So you both just, let 20 years go by. I had no dad, no family, just stories about a man who didn't exist." Michael knelt beside the wheelchair, meeting his son's eyes. "You deserved better. You have every right to hate me. But please know this, I never stopped loving her. Not for a single day. If I'd known about you, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." The anger in Luke's face trembled, uncertain now, as if he were fighting between belief and denial. "You really didn't know?" he asked quietly. Michael shook his head. I thought she died. I buried her memory, but not her love. Luke's hands loosened on the wheels. He looked at his mother, tears beginning to form. You should have told me, Mom. I know, she said softly, kneeling beside him. I was trying to protect you from pain, from questions I couldn't answer. I thought it was enough to love you. He exhaled shakily. It wasn't. She nodded, accepting the weight of it without protest. I know. For a long time no one spoke. The only sound was the creak of the old house, the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Michael sat back on his heels, unsure whether to stay or go. Then Luke looked up, studying him quietly. So what now? The boy asked. Michael hesitated. Now, I don't know. Maybe we start small. A cup of coffee. A conversation. I'd like to get to know you. If you'll let me. Luke stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he extended a hand. Michael reached out, hesitating for a breath before their hands met. The grip was tentative at first, then firm. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something alive, something that might grow. Isabella turned away, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. The sight of them together, father and son, two branches of a life she thought had burned away, was more than she could bear. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was steady, quiet. You look just like her when you're angry, he said, and for the first time, Luke almost smiled. Outside, the clouds began to break, and a fragile beam of sunlight slipped through the window, falling across their joined hands. Thin, uncertain, but real. It felt like the first light after a very long night. A year later, spring returned to Ashland with a kind of quiet grace. The mountains were soft with mist in the mornings, and the pine trees behind the Bennett home glowed emerald under the new light. The air smelled of rain and earth and second chances. The house itself was different now, rebuilt, renewed. Michael had bought a small place at the edge of town and renovated it himself, with Luke's help and Isabella's laughter filling the rooms that once echoed with silence. Where there had been walls of gray, there was now color. Where there had been emptiness, there was life again. Luke had changed, too. After months of physical therapy and one long, complicated surgery in Portland, he was walking again, slowly, carefully, but walking. The first time he crossed the living room without his crutches, Isabella cried openly and Michael had to turn away, pretending to adjust a picture frame just to keep from breaking down himself. Luke had rolled his eyes good-naturedly. You two are worse than my doctors, he'd said, smiling through the effort. Now he was stronger. He volunteered at a local design shop, sketching new ideas for adaptive equipment. His girlfriend, Rachel Torres, a bright, outspoken art student with curls like sunlight, often joined them for dinner. She'd bring flowers from the market and tease Luke about his stubborn independence until the whole house was laughing. As for Isabella, she had gone back to teaching. After years of hiding in quiet jobs, she was finally standing in front of a classroom again, her voice steady and warm as she guided a room full of second graders through spelling lessons and stories about the world. Michael had been the one to encourage her, filling out the applications with her, fixing up the old car so she could drive to work. You were meant for this, he'd told her. You always were. He, too, had found a different kind of peace. His business continued to thrive, but he no longer worked to fill an emptiness. The shoes he made now were personal, custom orders hand-stitched with care. Sometimes, late at night, Isabella would sit nearby while he worked, the two of them sharing quiet conversation like people who no longer needed to fill the silence. That evening, the house smelled of roasted vegetables and bread. The dinner table was set for 4. Luke moved around with a slight limp, but no crutches, helping Rachel pour wine. Isabella stood at the stove, wearing a pale linen apron, her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. The silver bracelet still glimmered on her wrist, catching the light whenever she reached for a dish. Michael watched her from across the room, the way the firelight danced on her skin, the way laughter had returned to her face. There was something almost unreal about it. Their family, rebuilt from ashes, sitting around a table that once existed only in dreams. During dinner, Rachel told a story about Luke tripping over a toolbox in the shop, and everyone laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. Luke threw up his hands in mock offense. It was one time. "You're lucky you bounce," Michael said, grinning. The conversation turned to plans, Rachel's art exhibit, Isabella's school picnic, a weekend trip they wanted to take to Crater Lake in the summer. The idea of returning there, the place where it all began, made Isabella's smile falter for a second. Michael reached across the table, brushed her hand gently and whispered, "It's different now. We're different." Her eyes softened. "Yes," she said quietly, "we are." Later that night, after the dishes were done and Rachel and Luke had gone out for a walk, Michael and Isabella stepped onto the porch. The forest stretched out before them, the wind moving gently through the pines. Above, the stars flickered like scattered embers across the dark. Isabella leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about the fire?" she asked softly. "Every day," he said, "but I think about what came after even more." She smiled, her hand resting on his chest. The silver bracelet caught the moonlight, gleaming like a thread that had refused to break. In that quiet moment, with the scent of pine and the laughter of their son echoing faintly through the open window, it was clear love had outlived everything that tried to destroy it. Fire, time, and loss. And at last, home wasn't a place they built. It was the life they found again together,